that many people. I'm going to let people just sort of introduce themselves first, just so you know who's in the room, Stephanie, and then I'll introduce Stephanie. We'll jump right into it. Let's start with Cam.
Fedora. Millicent.
Beth.
I am C.
Daniel.
Amanda. Beth.
Taylor.
Tom. Marie in the back.
Barry. Dahlia.
And Wade Radke. I'm here with Fairgrounds, and when we first took over Fairgrounds almost 2 years ago, one of the things we set up, for those of you who've never been to a dialogue, is these occasional conversations about issues that people have brought to us, or things that are in the community that are exciting, or if we happen to find somebody coming through town we know that's got something interesting to say, we try to throw some posters up. And we were talking before we started with Stephanie about, you never know, sometimes it's a handful of us, sometimes we have to get extra chairs. I happen to be reading, I was out of town most of July and working and vacationing in Montana. And coming back, I read stacks of the papers, you know, the Advocate, the former daily paper, the Times-Picayune, and then the Times and Wall Street Journal. And one of the things I stumbled onto was this article in the Advocate that said that we had a new book written very interestingly by a local journalist, Stephanie Hepburn, about who had come to New Orleans not long after Katrina. Down here with her family. And for those of you who were here at that time, you can remember all the sort of tent cities and City Park and elsewhere. There's a whole working class, if you will, of people that after disasters show up with a bobcat in the back, a Airstream trailer or an old trailer here, a pop-up. We had people coming down from Wyoming with a utility truck to help build houses here. So people just sort of flocked in, and Stephanie was, at least as I read the article in the Advocate, was impressed at what she was seeing and started looking into this. She has a background both having studied law and as a journalist. And she and her co-author finished this book, Trafficking Around the World, which Tom has brought some copies and it'll be offered for sale after she's finished. But it's a story of some of these problems about global workers' rights and worker exploitation, if you will, in some 20 countries, I think.
Right.
So, how many?
24.
24 to be exact, 20 plus or minus, but there's always more that are involved in this. But they look closely at 24, and we asked her in the usual way that we run these dialogues. She's going to give us some sense of what was in the book and what she learned, and then once she has let us know more about that, we're going to open it up, as always, to questions and answers. The only rule for those of you who have been here, we always end at 8:30. It's an old rule. We try to get people so you can then talk among yourselves or with Stephanie or whatever, but it won't be so late that you have to go and ask your mom permission for the key to get back in the house. So Stephanie, we're delighted to have you here at Fairgrounds Dialogue. So jump on in, and I'll give you back your book until I buy it, and tell people all about what's happening around the world for workers and others.
Okay, so first I want to also say if any parts don't make sense or you have some questions, you can jump in. I don't have this, I mean, it's a very intimate atmosphere, so that's fine. So I moved here, it's February 2006, and as everybody knows, that wasn't very long after Hurricane Katrina. And I moved here from New York City, so that transition in itself was vast. It was quite an adjustment. And on my second day, my husband took me on a devastation tour, and we went to City Park. And when we were driving by, I noticed this tent city, and it was these colorful tents. It was tent after tent after tent, and I started to wonder who's living here. I mean, this is something. My mom's from Colombia, South America, Bogota, and it was something that you'd see, you know, on the outskirts of Bogota, or you'd see like in Brazil. So for me, it was broke from my idea of the United States, you know, this notion that I had about growing up in the U.S. and it's something that I wouldn't have expected to see. So nobody, you know, I asked around, nobody really knew what was going on in these tents, whether they were workers, whether they, had running water, what was happening. But, and I still, to this day, I don't know very much about that particular case. I know that they were able to shower for $5 a day. Now, I don't know if they were all workers or they were some people that were displaced. I still, to this day, don't know. But it got me thinking and wondering what was happening in the city. And the more research I did, the more I realized, well, this is a really ideal situation, not just for labor exploitation, but for human trafficking. So labor exploitation, there's certain elements that go into it that bump it up to human trafficking. And I would say that the crux of that is the deprivation of freedom. So not being allowed to come and go. Those are some of the key elements which changes it from for instance, labor exploitation to forced labor. So I started researching, and one of the first cases that I came across is one that I talk about a lot because I think it's such a microcosm of what you see, not only what happens in the US, but what happens in every single nation that I looked at. And it was this Thai worker case. And the workers were recruited by a US company hired a recruiter to go to Bangkok and recruit workers to bring in on agricultural visas. And in order to secure the visas, the workers had to put up $11,000, which of course, the first question that people ask me is how in the world, if somebody's looking for a job from another nation, are they going to be able to afford putting down a fee for $11,000? I mean, that's a very natural question. Well, what ends up happening is they have to take out loans, and they have to take out, put up their land, put up the land of their family members, put up the land of, people who are close to them who are willing to invest in this person's future. So, and on top of it, of course, you have astronomical interest rates. So it's not just $11,000, it's $11,000 plus these astronomical interest rates. So what happens? Instantaneously, these workers are, indebted, and they're $11,000 in debt. And so the part of the sales pitch of the recruiter was, hey, they're going to work really hard for you. They're already in debt. That was actually something that they blatantly stated, which is, I think, amazing. So anyhow, the workers came in, and as soon as they came into the U.S., the employers took away their documentation, took away anything that was identifying, so visas, return tickets, all of that, they took it away from them. And they were monitored by armed guards. So that's where I was talking about the movement, so that's what raises it to a different level. And so initially they were in North Carolina and they were doing agricultural work, and then afterward they were taken to do demolition in New Orleans, and they ended up, their last stop was the Capri Hotel. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that hotel, but it was just like many other buildings in New Orleans. It was dilapidated. You're talking about mold. There was no running water. I mean, these are horrible conditions, and of course the workers are not being paid for any of this.
A lot of that, in that case, was before the storm, too.
That's true. This happened to be, this happened.
Capri was
of course.
never in great shape.
No, right. But it happened, at that moment in time, happened to be one of many in very similar circumstances. So when you look at the, the perfect storm of what happened after Katrina, you're looking at multiple elements. You're looking at the fact that you have a devastated city, and you have an infrastructure that is not stable. You have a population that's in flux. And at the same time, the government suspended many worker protections. So then you add that to the mix, and it's this ideal situation for human trafficking. And then on top of it, you have a sudden demand for low-wage labor, which creates this ideal opportunity for somebody to come in and take enormous advantage of people. So with the Thai workers, they weren't being paid, so they couldn't eat. But the armed guard was telling them, you have to pay me to eat. So they ended up setting up traps to catch pigeons, and that's how they would eat. So that case to me, I mean, something, you know, when people think about the United States, that's not generally the association that they're gonna have. But it's really not that uncommon. I think New Orleans was very much a microcosm of what you see everywhere, but at the same time, you see this in other places in the United States. And so I think that that's important to recognize too. We're a first world nation. And so I think because of that, there are a lot of ideas that, well then, that can't be happening here. And I think that there needs to be an understanding, no, it certainly does happen here. And on top of it, part of the reason it happens here is because the United States is very attractive. So part of the appeal for the Thai workers, for instance, wasn't just that they were gonna have an $8.24 an hour job. It was the fact that they were gonna be come in legally on visas. And they were told, you know, as a lot of people who are brought in on temporary visas, they're told that it's not temporary. So I think that it needs to be understood that there's no such thing as a nation that's able to avoid this scenario. So after looking at these cases, and I looked at 9 really large cases in the United States, large cases in New Orleans, and then I spread out to the entire United States, and then I started examining countries, and cumulatively there were 24 different nations that I looked at. And people always ask me, well, why did you choose those 24 nations? You know, are they the worst? Are they the best? Are they? And no, I wanted to choose something that I felt was very reflective of our world. So it's not sensationalized. So it's looking at a snapshot of pieces, first world, second world, third world, all cumulatively put together to actually get something that I felt or hoped would be an accurate snapshot of what's going on in the United States. So as I did my research, I think most people, when they think of human trafficking, they think of sex trafficking. I mean, I think that's just part of what, and you probably don't because you're constantly thinking of, fair trade. But for most people, that's probably the avenue that they're gonna mentally go down because that's what's in the newspapers, that's what's in the movie theaters, that's what's more sensationalized and what we're more in tune with is sexual exploitation. But I think what needs to be understood is that forced labor is actually the bigger portion of that pie. So when we look at statistics, or actually these are estimates, when we look at the estimates, it's 20.9 million people that are estimated to be affected, victims of human trafficking. And so of that 20.9, 78% are forced labor victims, and 22% are sex trafficking victims. Now, to me, it doesn't make sense to really differentiate. To me, it's all indentured servitude. It's just different purposes and different forms of exploitation. So legally, it doesn't make sense to me, but that's just the way it's been drawn up over the years in many nations. To me, it's all in indentured servitude. But yeah.
Can you repeat that number, 20.9?
20.9 million.
Okay.
Yeah. Now that's an estimate, of course.
Right.
Knowing exactly the effects of human trafficking is very challenging. So part of what I did is, of course, try to get a very as accurate a picture as possible. So that meant that I looked at government numbers, but of course we all know that that's valuable to some degree, right? Particularly if the law doesn't include half of the different forms of human trafficking, well then there you go, the numbers aren't going to be accurate. I actually, because I'm a journalist, I took a little bit of a different approach and went through newspaper after newspaper after newspaper to find cases and kind of work backwards, because a lot of these are miscategorized. And I know what the elements are, so I was able to go through and say, oh, okay, this is a case of human trafficking, and able to add those numbers in and examine those cases. So I tried to pull from all sorts of sources to come up with, figures that I felt at least were as accurate as possible of those identified. Now, of course, that's the tip of the iceberg, who's identified, who's not identified. The majority of people we're gonna guess are not identified, right? So, so that was my goal. And then looking at, and when we look at forced labor, I think one thing that people don't understand is that it often involves sex. I mean, people think that, oh, forced labor, well, that's a different thing. People they're doing work that they want to be doing. So therefore, it's a little less people, their perception is that they seem to sympathize a little less for whatever reason with forced labor than they do with sex trafficking. But what they don't understand is that, you know, when you put all of the different elements together, it's a horrible scenario, and sex very much is often another tool, another way to control people, whether it's for, you know, the actual act of sexual exploitation or whether it's for forced labor. Sex is often used. So, in looking at it, and actually probably most of you guys are quite aware in terms of, you know, fair trade and the relationship. What does this mean? You know, so people talk about human trafficking, they talk about exploitation, they talk about these different, so where is this line drawn, and what does that mean, and what can you really do? You know, I think that tends to be the question. You know, after reading my book, people are like, and that's horrible, and now what do we do? And so I think what's important is to look at, you know, right now what's been very prevalent in the media, it's been looking at factories. So US and European companies that have factories in various places. We've heard a lot about Bangladesh recently, right? So when you think about that, most people aren't gonna associate that with human trafficking. But what you'll see is that the more that companies are forced to be transparent, and the more that they're able to and forced to, or there's pressure to show what happens from farm to factory, the more that you're going to be able to eliminate not just you know, labor exploitation generally, but also anything that rises above that, because the standard has been set. So when people say, well, what do we do? I think it's important to look at how transparent is the company that you're buying goods from, for instance. How transparent is it? You know, and there's actually this app that I found. It's called Free to Work, and I think it's pretty cool. And I'm sure there are other things out there, but I thought it was really fascinating. And it actually grades different clothing apparel companies, because that's a big deal. It grades them and says, okay, for instance, H&M is an A. They're very transparent from farm to factory. Now that doesn't mean if a company isn't transparent that they for sure or certainly are somehow you know, leaving openings for exploitation. But what it means is we don't know, right? So it's going to make you less comfortable to purchase from those particular companies. So I think that the more that there's this sort of attention on that, this improves not just labor exploitation, but this improves human trafficking as well. So I think that there are measures, there are things that we can do and steps that we can take to make a difference. And I think just actually having a conversation, just talking to you guys going home or going out or doing whatever, and having a conversation with somebody else and saying, I had no idea that this fell under, you know, the domain of, you know, of human trafficking, or I didn't think about, you know, my apparel, or you know, there's this app that I can look at that, okay, well now I'm going to check it out. I'm going to have some dialogue with people and maybe take some measures to think about where my goods are coming from. So I think those are some of the measures that you could actually take.
Chocolate and things like that, as you look at do that about?
Well, I think that, well, in each country, so I looked at forced labor, I looked at sex trafficking, organ trafficking, which is its own unique thing. And then on top of it, I also examined different countries have different scenarios. And so each country, I looked at the various pressures and the various things that make that country's scenario unique. So for instance, in South Africa, they have something called muti murder, which is the killing of people for, they use the organs for various forms of traditional medicine. And people who are actual medicine men or traditional, involved in traditional medicine do not believe in this. This is, you know, this is not what most people think. But there's a small sect, and that's been an issue in South Africa, for instance. In China, you know, you have the one-child rule, right? So when you think about, well, what happens then? So what you have is pressure to provide a male heir, right? So then, well, then we all know the various things that can happen to a female that's born, right? So the ratio right now is so distorted that there's so many more men than there are women, and that creates this pressure to what? Get women. So then you look at each country and look at these various, is there an economic surplus, like you'll see in the UAE? Well, then there's an economic surplus. What do? They need to build, they need to, there's the sudden demand for building, construction, so then that's going to create its own scenario. So each country has its own thing. But of course, there's so much commonality at the same time, even though each country has its own unique formula and unique things that make their trafficking scenario. There's some things that are so similar, and that brings me back to the Thai example, the Thai worker example, which is this formulaic way that traffickers have gotten this down, which is first we're going to offer you a job, then we're going to make you pay and put yourself in debt in order to secure the job. Then we're going to take away your movement. You're not going to be able to move, whether it's through actual armed guards or whether it's through abuse or intimidation or taking away your documentation. So then these things, like whether it's for sex, whether it's for forced labor, it's so incredibly formulaic that's one of the challenges that law enforcement has, is that traffickers have this down. They know what they're doing, and it's the same formula in every country.
Who's doing a good job of stopping it?
So when you look to me, there's some countries where they have not included certain forms of trafficking. So to them, they're like, we don't have a trafficking problem. There's no trafficking happening here, and it's because they don't include various forms of human trafficking. So when you look at who's doing a good job, who's not doing a good job, I think it goes back again to this concept, not just transparencies for companies, but transparency for governments. How transparent are they with their figures? Are they including every form of human trafficking, or are they not? What are they doing? Are they putting out an annual report where they are examining not other nations per se, but their own issues and their own problems and their own human trafficking scenarios? Is that what's happening? So when I look at a country that puts out a report, so Germany's, I think, a good example. They put out a report. I think that they lean too much in the sex trafficking direction, but that's pretty much every nation that I look at leans primarily in that direction. And when I say that, I by no means am diminishing the horribleness that is sex trafficking. I'm just saying that the scope needs to be broadened so that there are other forms that are looked at and examined, and traffickers aren't getting away with the exploitation. Because right now that's what's happening, is that even those countries that have laws on the books that are examining or stating that it's, forced labor is illegal, which a lot of them do, there's no enforcement. So what I would like is to see, enforcement go to all forms of human trafficking, not just filter to one sector, and even in that direction, not completely efficiently.
Are you ready for questions?
Sure.
You're looking around, I don't want to be the only one, but anybody already can?
You talked about, well, you mentioned a few different times, like other forms of human trafficking. Is there like some sort of standard list out there of what is human trafficking? Like where do you get that yardstick?
Well, so then you start looking at different definitions of human trafficking. And so I think each country has their own definition, but the standard is the Palermo Protocol.
Okay.
And the Palermo Protocol, basically, where you're looking at sex trafficking, forced labor, bonded labor, hereditary traditional slavery. It encompasses all forms of what you would think, and I think it's a really good question, because I think when most people think of trafficking, they hear the word traffic and they think people being moved from one place to another, right? I think that that's a natural idea. But the thing is, and while I think that was very much the intent of the original focus or anti-trafficking movement, I think they started to realize, wait, these things are all connected. And so that's been used as the umbrella, and so it's still called trafficking. I would say that modern day slavery is probably the more accurate term, but people don't associate, trafficking is something that they think it's movement from one place to another, and it's not.
And so there are just countries out there that aren't recognizing this Palermo document. as
Some recognize,
an authority?
well, some do, so basically they ratify it. So they either ratify it or they haven't ratified it. Most of the countries that I looked at have ratified it. But the problem is that doesn't mean that they necessarily implemented it or put it into their own domestic law. So you can't just say, you can't just ratify it. You know, there are certain expectations that come after that, and certain obligations in order to, once you've ratified it, certain obligations that you need to live up to. But a lot of nations haven't fully completed that. And what part of that puzzle is, you know, some laws, you know, they'll just refer to the Palermo Protocol as if it's its own standing thing. No, it has to be integrated in the nation's own domestic laws. So, so part of it is improper implementation or no implementation at all.
So is there a parallel society of companies that know and expect that they can do this, and are they first family capacities?
Well, what do you mean? Are there companies that feel that they can get away with this? Or, yeah. I mean, trafficking.
You're asking if it's somebody's business model.
If they're overt.
Does someone base their profit models on free labor?
Is there a Mardi Gras?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting, actually. I don't know if I included it in this, but there's actually, and I thought this was fascinating. So when I was doing research, it was a U.S. recruiting company, and I don't know if I included it. It was really fascinating. It was a U.S. recruiting company, and they were bringing people in on H-2B visas from Mexico. And it was a calculator. So they're like, how much do you want to spend? And so you'd enter in how much you want to spend, how many hours you want the workers to work. And it became, I think the overall cost was something ridiculous, like $3 per worker per hour, or something, you know, atrocious. They have taken it down, and they are, you know, in a suit right now. So obviously I don't know all the nuances about that particular case, but most likely there was some shady things happening there.
When you did Louisiana, did you find first families who were part of this trafficking?
Well, there were New Orleans companies that were certainly part of it. And to be honest, what I think is kind of fascinating is that some of the, and I don't know how true this is, but for instance, one of the, and you'll see this, you know, I think in labor exploitation by itself too, but there was a guy who started a recruiting company. I think he was on the North Shore. And his response was, oh, I didn't realize there was anything wrong with withholding documents. That was his claim. He said, I had no idea. I had no idea I couldn't hold their
I
passports.
don't want them to lose their stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, no, I think his mentality was, you get that after you do the work.
Yeah.
And that was,
Ignorance of the law is an excuse.
Well, no, they knew what they were doing.
well, that's my assumption. My assumption is that he certainly knew what he was doing.
But he wasn't penalized.
And in that case, the Department of Justice, I know, has been, or had at some point, he had been on their radar. Nothing's happened since, so I don't know if they dropped the case or it wasn't viable enough, or I don't know what happened. But there's been no lawsuit associated with it.
Is he
at
still
all.
holding their passports?
No. Yeah. That part, yeah, no. Fortunately, that part was taken care of.
I mean, we have, you know, active cases of slavery in the United States. I don't know that everybody recognizes it, but certainly the Immokalee workers had a big set of cases around slavery in Florida. When was that? A couple of years ago, but I don't know if that's in the book or not, but you know what I'm talking about.
Right.
So people were coming over to work in the fields in Florida, and same situation, no papers, whatever, living in shacks, and just couldn't leave. And they actually arrested somebody for slavery, some labor contractor, and that's, I can remember even before Katrina, we were called on, our union was called on one situation with a bunch of cleaners who were working, were some second or third contract coming off a ship, were working to clean the holes of a ship. And we're literally living in virtually box crates down off of Girard, where the new fancy Rouse is in the CBD, right around there, around the Cadillac place, if you know where that area is. and we're, locked in, no ventilation, no food, locked in, taken down, to the port, put in the whole of the ship to clean it out for a 12-hour shift, taken back in a truck, and somehow one of them called us, and I can still remember Rose and some of the organizers, it's just an amazing situation. Did anybody go to jail? No, I mean, by
Right.
the time we got to somebody, they moved the whole operation. Does that not happen?
Well, there's also often a hesitation to use the anti-trafficking law, the TVPA. And I don't know if it's because it's not new per se, but I've noticed that when it comes to labor exploitation or forced labor, a lot of prosecutors prefer to use the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act. What's weird is that they could certainly use both. One doesn't preclude the other. So I haven't figured out, I've talked to some attorneys to try to figure out, well, what's the deal? I think that maybe it's,
Is the DOL supposed to enforce them first?
no, so
Who's
that,
supposed to enforce them?
so if you have, you can have civil suits in either of those situations, which is the benefit, thank goodness. The law,
The wage and hour enforces FLSA.
correct, but you can still bring a civil suit for FLSA.
Yeah, no, but on the trafficking law you just referenced.
The TVPA can be
Who is
also civil
supposed to,
suit.
but is the DOL supposed to enforce?
Not
that?
the Department of Labor, no, that would be the Department of Justice.
Oh, it is DOJ.
Yeah,
Okay.
DOJ. So, oh yeah, you can sit there. Hi, how are you doing? So, no, yeah, that would be, so you have your civil suits and then you have your federal. So the TVPA, fortunately, victims can bring suits on their own. But the problem is often prosecutors just, I don't know, they don't go that route. And when I talked to the attorneys, their guess was, well, it's efficiency. You don't want somebody to be stuck, in a 2-3 year lawsuit. But the problem is, the result is then you have traffickers who are essentially getting a slap on the wrist. So what for them? It doesn't stop their business. They continue onward. While, somebody is accused and found guilty of being a trafficker, the stigma is much stronger. So to me, that there's an incentive there to push forward with the suit using the actual.
Are there caps on penalties under the trafficking
Well, we'd have to get into the nuances of the trafficking law. So there,
law? But if you sue, DOJ
it's
picks it
a
up.
harsher penalty, unless you're able
We're obviously
to.
capped out on FLSA, fairly
but
beginning action can
that's,
only
yeah.
get,
Yeah, you're gonna get a slap on the
3
wrist.
year, double time over 3 years, and you have to prove intent to get better than that, and there are caps, so if somebody just steals your wages under Fair Labor Standards, yeah, there's a penalty, you go through the process, but it's not
But you
like,
miss the other elements, right? No,
Yeah.
you're right. You're exactly right, and so that ends up, in my mind, it undermines, it undermines the victim, it puts them in this position where they really didn't get justice, and then on top of it, the trafficker's like, okay, cool, I can proceed, It's a risk that's worth taking, and when you look at what's the incentive for traffickers, it's money, right? So if the consequences, chances are you're not gonna be caught, and chances are, even if you are caught, there's not gonna be, you're gonna get a slap on the wrist, well then, that's a risk worth taking, right? So that's why I think, using the TVPA more often would be.
Are
What is
there any
TVPA
lawyers or any organizations out there that are actually advocating for using that aspect of the law, or?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I mean, I think.
And are there any here in New Orleans? Because it's a port city, as you, I'm sure,
Oh, yeah.
study, there's so much.
Oh, yeah. No, and there are certainly great anti-trafficking advocates here in New Orleans, and the general southern region and throughout the United States. So yes, certainly. And I think that it ends up being one of these things that I think in the calculus, when these decisions are made by prosecutors, I don't think that they themselves are trying to undermine it. I think they're trying to figure out, it's kind of a race against the clock. You have people who have been applying for permanent visas, and there's this race with the clock, whether they're going to be deported or whether they're going to actually get their visa, and so expediting the process is beneficial. So I see that there's some reasons to try to expedite it. I don't necessarily agree with sacrificing not using it. I think it's better to use it. Yeah.
So to follow up on your question, what are some groups that people might reach out to if they want to learn more about that?
Well, I think that, are you talking about actual anti-trafficking groups, or are you talking about what happens if somebody is trafficked? If somebody's trafficked, you have Eden House, which is here. I'm sure you guys have heard of it. But probably the first step is calling the Polaris Project. And the Polaris Project is our national center, hotline, resource for anything that involves human trafficking. So I think that's a good first step is contacting them and figuring out, whether you're just passing the ball along and saying, hey, this is something that I'm noticing, and I don't know if it's human trafficking, but something feels wrong. I think somebody needs to look into it. I've been watching this building being built, and the workers seem scared, or this woman's working at this person's house, but she seems like she's losing weight and she's fearful, she can't leave. If you start noticing those type of things, there's no harm in calling them and getting the ball rolling to investigate.
At least a year ago, the Archdiocese had some staff that said they were working on
Yes,
this issue.
they
I
are.
don't know what
Are
happened.
they focused on sexual trafficking?
A lot of groups are focused on sex trafficking, but you have some groups here that are also focused on forced labor. And those groups that are focused on sex trafficking, I think, while I'm pushing to make sure that everything is covered, I think that the good thing is that there's a trend also supporting that, and that more and more these groups that have been primarily focused on sex trafficking are starting to think, well, what can we do in order to examine forced labor and provide housing for forced labor victims, investigate. So I think that there is a push across the board to make sure that happens.
I think if you looked at the Department of Justice grants, you would see the activity pegged to what they're willing to fund. And all I've seen is sex trafficking, although now they are getting into the safe houses.
Well, so if you look at, the State Department puts out their trafficking in persons report, right? It's called the TIP report. And what's interesting is that for the first time, I think it was last year's report, they showed more identified victims of forced labor than they did of sex trafficking. That's the first year that it happened. And I think it's actually the first year that the United States fully examined itself, which was, I think, a very positive step in my book. Because it's hard to say, we're going to look at all of these countries. I think the report is excellent, but we're going to look at all of these countries and we're not going to fully examine ourselves. Like, that makes it a little less valid, right? So.
Do you think that has come from the immigration groups who've been able to bust some of the companies who are doing that?
The momentum, where the push is coming from, you mean?
I would say the numbers that, the states, the U.S. is able to document.
I think it's awareness. I think it's awareness that, and this is not just in the United States, but across the globe, an awareness that forced labor is really a primary issue that we need to be focusing on. And again, not to take away from sex trafficking, the focus that already exists on sex trafficking needs to remain there, but there needs to be a broader scope. And I think now that there's awareness across the globe, and there is this push to identify forced labor victims, we're going to see an increase in identification of forced labor victims. Not saying that there's been an increase of forced labor victims per se, but that there's an increase in the identification of them. So I think that that's happening across the globe.
I have a two-part question.
Yeah.
First being, I know how domestic laws work and their applicability and enforceability. However, on the international spectrum, also having studied that, there's a whole lot, like you say, well, we adopt this, but there's really nothing in place. When you have a situation such as the Thai example,
Yeah.
what law is applicable and what choice of law rules are followed? Then the second part of the question is, locally here, what organizations are actually working to enforce those laws and apply them?
Well, okay, so you have a couple of issues. One, the Department of Labor does investigations here. And so when we look even back at the Thai example or the Post-Katrina scenario, what you're going to see is that there was actually a decrease in the number of investigations that happened before Katrina, the year before Katrina, and the year after. There was a 37% decrease. So that can't happen. That's part of the problem. So I think that there needs to be awareness and enforcement. And that's the Department of Labor's job to be able to go in and investigate those cases. We had another situation, which is that H-2B visas were really, really, really under monitored. And even that is, it really wasn't monitored. So the problem with that is that the result was, what's going to happen when something's not monitored? It's chaos. And it creates a situation where exploitation, it creates a loophole in a situation where labor exploitation can happen, and it can rise to the level of human trafficking. So that was a big issue, and it wasn't until, and it went back and forth between Homeland Security and the Department of Labor, and nobody was claiming it. You can look at the history, and I can talk to you more about it afterwards, what the history was. But the end result was, finally in 2008, proper regulations were put in place, which is huge. So that's a big step. But I don't know, you can have regulations and still not have proper enforcement. So and that's kind of what we see when I looked at, the 24 countries. This is a chronic issue. You have countries that just deny that certain forms are happening. And then you have a lot of countries that have, the right regulations on the books, but enforcement isn't happening. And there's just not proper education. So, and when we say not proper education, I mean, that judges are not properly trained, and prosecutors are not properly trained on new laws. And so the result is, if they're not familiar with the new law, they don't want to use it. And they don't want somebody coming into their courtroom using it. So what's going to happen? No, you use rape or you use some other lesser charge, we'll go with that instead of the anti-trafficking law.
So outside of the Department of Labor and the Department of Justice, outside the government, are there any local firms or any other not-for-profits or anything that are trying to prosecute or?
Yeah, so then you look at attorneys, you look at groups or nonprofits or individual attorneys. Yeah, certainly, and that would be the civil aspect. So if federal isn't going to pick it up, then you would go the civil route. Yeah, certainly, and there are attorneys, in New Orleans and in Louisiana generally that will focus on that. Yeah. Yes.
I'm curious if you found anything in your research that was specific to this area, as far as just demographics or the type of labor. If there was anything specific about New Orleans that you found is different than what?
You mean pre-Post-Katrina? Because Post-Katrina is kind of what created this. It would be really hard for me to talk about New Orleans.
Well, just since you moved.
Since I moved here. And since I moved here, yeah, so what you're going to see is the same situation that you'll see in any country that's experienced a natural disaster. It's the same thing. You see the floods in India, and you see the repercussions, what happens after the floods in India. Well, the same thing. You have people that are displaced and they've been moved, and so then you have an influx again of population, and you have people who are desperate for either a job or they're somehow marginalized, and then you have people who are going to come in and take advantage of that opportunity. So you'll see the same thing. I mean, what we see in New Orleans, you can see, in India, or you can look at Colombia, and you have a country that's had civil unrest for years and years and years. What happens? You have migration. As soon as you have migration, you have vulnerability. As soon as people are being moved from one, or moving themselves in order to avoid war or to avoid conflict. I mean, you're going to see that in Iraq. You're going to see that, and I'm very closely watching Syria and Egypt to see what happens next with human trafficking, because the formula is following the exact pattern that you would see and did see in Iraq.
There's a story in the New Yorker a week ago about the refugee camps, 150,000 people in Syria, exactly the situation. I mean, what's always surprising to me is how prevalent it really is. I mean, you may not see it every day, but there's around the world, and even here, there's a tremendous amount of this. Quarry workers in India who have literally been working on these quarries for generations now, because they're impressed by, debt from grandfathers sometimes, that goes on and on. And The reports of Western Africa around the chocolate industry and basically holding children virtually in slavery for 5-10 years before they can get out in order to harvest the crop. And every big company, Nestle's and Cadbury and all of them have essentially had legal actions
Yes.
that have been brought to them in Europe, not so much here, for slavery. But you think, oh, well, chocolate, everybody buys, chocolate. Everybody buys this, that, and the other, but you have people impressed into labor, it's just incredible.
Right. Right,
Yeah,
child
children.
labor. And child labor makes a huge chunk of the victims of forced labor are children. So-
Yeah, we run into the problem on chocolate. We still offer some kind of fair trade chocolate here, don't we? And of course, the cost is prohibitive. So, but, you don't want to have that many conversations across the coffee bar. Well, yeah, it's really expensive, but on the other hand, how would you like, child slavery and a Hershey bar? There's got to be a limit to how much we'll say. Instead, we just sort of put it there and hope somebody buys it, and maybe they, sort of got the message. But it's wild out there.
Well, and I think from the optimistic perspective, the
Let's
hope
hear that.
is.
Let's really optimistic.
Right, well,
Let's go
yeah. So I think that the hope is, that the more that there's pressure on these groups, and the more that, in my opinion, the more trafficking suits that are brought forward, there's a force for transparency. And so I think the more transparent, there's a pressure for instance, people thinking, you know what, I'm not going to buy that product. I don't know where it's coming from. I don't know what the deal is. And the more that the consumer changes, the more that it has to change. The companies have to change along with it. So the more that consumers say, you know what, we are. That's what we want to buy that. Or after these occurrences in Bangladesh, the entire world is focusing on, okay, so what's going to happen now? How are these companies going to protect the workers in these factories? And so there's a focus on that. The more there's a focus on it, the more the consumer's involved and wants to make sure that change happens.
I know consumer education has increased, but
Yes.
have you seen things or trends or whatever to help consumer education? Because I think that's the biggest thing.
I think that you're exactly right. That's where the gap is. And I think, so like after
Speaking of a problem, yeah.
Right. That's correct.
Right.
Right. But so, and they did just sign an agreement, but the agreement that they signed was pretty
The whole
shallow.
Bangladesh, the European
Right.
textile and apparel companies are leading, and Walmart, Gap, and others are
They was signed.
refusing to go with the European program that
Right.
includes paying for repairs that would make
And
garments coming from Bangladesh safe.
And transparency, which
Yeah.
to me is the key. They would have, not only, all of their reports would be public, and there would be public audits, which is a big deal. And that's what the
Walmart and Gap say they
European
want to
companies
still
do.
enforce themselves, so
That's right.
they'll give a report on how well they inspected their subcontractors. Well,
Right,
gee.
that's not good.
Let me sign up for that program. See, did you have your hand up before?
Yeah, I was wondering if there's an effort of educating populations specifically who seem to be at risk from trafficking.
Yes, and so I think that, so there are a lot of campaigns, so I'm sure, on TV you've seen certain campaigns or posters, and those are all good, but I think that the big issue and where campaigns are most successful is when they're very much targeted to that audience. So if, for instance, you're trying to inform sex workers about, what the signs of human trafficking are, what to avoid, what to be careful of, it needs to be targeted to sex workers. It can't just be a broad campaign. Same thing for forced labor. If we're looking at agricultural workers, and that's the vulnerable population, then the campaign needs to be targeted to agricultural workers. That seems to be where those campaigns are most successful. Some companies, and those are more, government-sponsored campaigns, right, where they've collaborated with some sort of ad agency. And you'll see that in Poland, you'll see that in the US, you'll see that all over. But again, I think when they're most successful, I could show that to you, and you're like, yeah, okay, I agree. But that's not meeting the target audience, right? So making sure it is somehow meeting the target audience. But then you have governments that have also done some interesting things. So like, for instance, Brazil has something called their dirty list. And their dirty list includes every 6 months, they update a list of companies where forced labor has been discovered. And you have to stay on the list for 2 years, and you can't get any government funding. Now, that sounds fantastic, and I'm a big supporter. Of course, there are some companies that have sued and managed to get out of it, managed to get off the list, and some of them are the ones that really need to be monitored. So, you know, I think part of it is making sure that they stick to that and make sure that those companies are not able to get themselves off the list.
I mean, you see these sort of like flashpoints, like people leaving Syria or Iraq. Is there like anyone who's like kind of going into the refugee camps and talking to people?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, there are. But whether they're being reached is a different thing. You know, some people are, but some people aren't really trusting of people coming in and telling them, you know, what, and also just having access to all people, all refugees. You know, that's not highly likely either. So yeah, and that was a big issue in Iraq.
Because
And will be most likely in Syria, and whatever happens with Egypt, I don't know.
the only country I know of, to get a visa to work outside the Philippines, you have to go through a special day of training prior to the issuance of a work visa to leave. And that's, of course, a country like some others that exports labor to the Middle East and the rest of the world, to go through what your rights are in that country, including, you know, how not to get ripped off on remittances. I mean, they depend on the importation of dollars from migrant workers as part of the national Philippine business model for how to stay alive as a country. So they actually try to make sure, at least at some minor level, a day is not going to solve every problem, but most countries, you know, in Malaysia and others, just ship you out and you're on your own and good luck. And,
And Poland has a similar goal, which is they know that a lot of their population is going to leave and get work and they come back, and so they know that they have a vulnerable population that's right there, their own citizens that are leaving. And so that's part of why they have such a huge push to make sure that people, that, you know, they're informed, and that, you know, if they're going to take a job, that they leave information and contact information and various documents, make sure that, you know, they really investigate and do a background check on any sort of employment that they may take abroad. So I think you're right. I think some companies, some countries are very cognizant that they have a vulnerable population and their citizens are the vulnerable population. And they do very much try to make sure that there's an awareness brought to that.
The front round was going to ask you about this. You told me that you said there was an issue with the Baxter School District and building school teachers. And for their
Right. Yeah, and I actually written about that case. And I don't know, I know the Department of Justice was looking into that case. I don't know where it's gone, but that was the RSD. Yeah, no, those teachers were basically being housed and paying an inordinate amount of money to be housed in housing that was provided by the recruiter. The recruiter was in control. The recruiter also made sure that the loans that were taken out were through a family member or an associate, so they had some sort of thing going on so they could get a cut, and of course it's associated with astronomical interest rates. So yeah, that
well, I hadn't heard about this with the opportunity in Baton Rouge.
yeah.
That takes your breath away.
Well, school teachers, not laborers.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think that needs to be understood too, is that exploitation happens, you know, across the board, and some visas are more monitored than others, but certainly, yeah, this case was one that exactly breaks the mold of what people's conceptions are.
And I think underlying all this is just the erosion of workers' rights worldwide.
Absolutely.
And that the countries who have had stronger workers' representative history are the ones who have embraced these trafficking forced labor laws, like Germany, perhaps some of the Scandinavian countries. What's frightening to me about the U.S. right now is because we've seen a huge erosion workers' rights. And also this whole dilemma of young people who are coming up with these enormous college debts, who are somewhat indentured and willing to work for less in very unattractive, unappealing conditions. And it just makes, you know, I know AmeriCorps and Teacher Corps and all those things are wonderful, but, you know, you're doing that to repay your college loan and you're living in really difficult conditions and difficult jobs. I mean, there's just all these.
So you're saying more from a cultural perspective, you're not saying that that's human trafficking, but you're saying from a cultural perspective,
It's predatory.
it's
It's predatory is what I'm saying,
Because
absolutely.
they're actually getting a waiver, they don't have to pay when they're AmeriCorps or Teacher Corps, but then they're a teacher or a teacher.
And I'm not dissing those programs, that's not what I mean to do.
No, I
I really just want to
But
go
it
back
puts
to the
people in
lack of
predatory
respect
situations,
for
which is
workers,
like,
you know,
right,
and
with
how
no-
willing we are under the guise of something else to hand over ourselves, you know, our time, our energy, and as young people, you know, I see that a lot. And this whole college loan thing is the same as somebody getting exorbitant interest rate, like, you know, someone from Thailand coming here. I mean, we have people in this country.
right. No, I don't disagree with that. And that's the other thing is that when you look at human trafficking, I think one population that often gets dropped out are internal cases of human trafficking. And that happens in the United States, that happens in every country. And that's another one that often falls under the radar because what people have been looking, when we go back to the definition of what, you know, trafficking, what people think of when they hear the word traffic, they think movement from one place to another, right? And they don't think about that happening within a nation. They don't think about the trafficking that can happen in any country. And so that population often falls under the radar, whether it's for forced labor or sex trafficking. And you have to look at how are victims identified? And they're often identified through raids, right? Whether it's for sex trafficking or forced labor, raids are how people are generally identified. And so what's going to be a red flag? Not being from the United States. If you're from the United States, you know, let's say you're arrested for prostitution, chances are they're not going to investigate whether you're a trafficking victim. So I think that's part of it too, is falling under the radar because of your citizenship or because of your residence, you know, your status.
So I know a little bit about in-house, but who funds that? I know they're in-house and funded somewhat by the Episcopal Diocese, but.
Yeah, I actually just met the person who started it about a month ago. And I haven't yet been able to take a tour or to really talk to her. I know that she did one, the State Department does their trafficking persons report, which I mentioned earlier, and she did, I want to say Jamaica, she did a report, she was living there, did a report for the State Department. So, and she very much focused on both sex trafficking and forced labor there, but I don't know that much about Eden House in particular.
I've never heard of it before, is it a new thing? or-
They have probably been here for the last 2 years, and I've met some of the clients there. And,
Yeah, they have a 2-year residency program for women,
For victims.
for female victims.
And they're not
Women.
foreign. They are often U.S.
Domestic,
Yeah,
right.
right. Yeah.
That's right.
So
Yeah,
it's just interesting that that's here.
and it's fantastic, yeah,
It's a really
fantastic.
good program.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what would be great is to have something akin to that for forced labor victims, but, and that's what, again, that needs to be, you know, some sort of complement to that type of program.
That goes back to what I'm talking about, the erosion of the workers' rights, because nobody gets, that's not inflammatory, that's not,
That's correct.
you know,
Right.
we get all inflamed about this thing because sex is there,
That's
you
right.
know, and it is horrible, and I'm not
No, exactly.
minimizing it at all. And this other is also just as, you know, restrictive.
Right, I think the other thing is that when people hear forced labor, it's, you know, we're talking about the activity that is being forced, that people are being forced to do. And so if it's an activity that people feel they normally want to do, there's a perception, oh, that's not as bad. But you have to look at these trafficking situations of forced labor. There was, for instance, one, it was in China, it's a 15-year-old, and he was working at a brick factory, and his boss said, you know, come with me, I want to show you something. He went with him, And he said, this is what happens when you're unproductive, and he shoved, not he, but he observed somebody being shoved into a mixing machine where the person was chopped into millions of pieces. And he said to this 15-year-old boy who was being forced to work there, now go tell your friends, go tell your colleagues that that's what happens to you when you're unproductive. So I think what people also don't realize is what the scope of forced labor is. I mean, I think that that's part of it. We are just so, we've been infiltrated and had so much exposure through movies, through newspaper articles about what sex trafficking is. And so we have a mental image, and maybe not always accurate, but we have like a good image of, what that means. When it comes to forced labor, people don't really know what that means, or the extent that it happens, or what that means. For instance, there was a case in Thailand, and it was at a shrimp factory, and whenever the workers were being unproductive, according to, the company, they had metal rods thrust up their noses, and they were stripped naked, and their heads were shaved, and they were sexually molested. And so it's like, I think that there needs to be just also a push for greater awareness of what this means, instead of just hearing this concept, okay, well, that's not fair. And that's kind of the association. They hear forced labor, they're like, that's not fair, but they don't think about what that means because they don't have as many examples of what that means.
Or the examples aren't current. You think about, people going to the gulags and,
Yeah.
Siberia, and chains dragging or something like that. And
Right, not realizing what's happening
yeah,
today.
it's, the whole notion that you could drive right through the CBD or along the port in Bywater or down the Lower Nine or whatever and be passing somebody on the street who basically can't get out and doesn't know how to shout and speak another language and doesn't have papers and was dropped here from, heaven be gone to the Lord help them, and that's where you're stuck. So.
And that's why, the second portion of the book is called Hidden in Plain Sight, because it's happening right in front of us. It's just, the more awareness that there is, I think the more that we'll realize, well, these are the different signs. Okay, the more that there's transparency, the more that there's awareness, the more we have conversations, the more we can say, something's up, because you now have an image in your head, or various images in your head of what forced labor is, just like you did previously for sex trafficking. And so I think just having that, you innately can say, okay, something's wrong here. And then it won't be so hidden in plain sight. You'll say, okay, I'm gonna call somebody, I'm gonna do something. It might not be labor exploitation, it might not be human trafficking, but at least what's it hurt to look into it, so.
I think part of it too is breaking down stereotypes as well, because one of the cases that I studied was a retired Saints football player wanted to continue his fortune and opened a lawn care business and basically trafficked Mexican workers over here. And because the stereotype is that Mexicans do yards, nobody even thought twice about it. And when in fact all of them had to go back to a shipping container, and they were kept in a shipping container every night and then taken in a truck back to the place where they got their polo shirt for that day. And then they were stripped down again and stuck back in the container. And this is a retired Saints football player, and the crew was working all throughout New Orleans, Dallas, Houston, and Austin. And it was so widespread, but again, it was one of those, oh, I didn't know I couldn't do that type of thing, and slap on the wrist and a little fine.
And people, you're saying people ignoring it because this is in their mind what they're used to seeing, so.
Yeah, so you're saying hidden in plain sight. Don't take things for granted.
Right.
Is he still doing it?
He used to organize
No.
janitors in Dallas. Virtually overnight, the market for janitorial contracts moved from largely companies that employ Latinos and African Americans to probably 80% Korean. And who speaks Korean? So you're all of a sudden, you're working these buildings in Dallas. It's not like New Orleans. I mean, big buildings, but of course, whole families were gang cleaning. They were coming in, 7, 8 o'clock at night. They'd sometimes go out at midnight, sometimes go out at 2 or 3 in the morning. Who is going to see, it's like a whole different world. Thousands of workers would come in, subcontracted, and paid nothing. And once again, just dropped over here, some Korean subcontractors, much like the apparel industry. People will be working with families, you'd see children there for, 6, 7, 8 years old. And we've seen that in New Orleans too, with some of these companies, but, it's just, trying to get something done about that. Well, we finally got some of it cleaned up with the DOL and whatnot, but whose job is that? I mean, none of us are walking by a building at midnight to see who's walking out of a 50-story building and whether or not they, and how do you communicate? I had to get friends in Korea to call people on the phone. I mean, it was just crazy what you had to do.
Right, and that's kind of what, going to the campaign idea, how beneficial is it to have these campaigns? And I do think that they're beneficial, but again, that goes to the idea of the targeted audience. Having a targeted audience, not just focusing on what form of exploitation, but also who might be exploited. Because you're right, if it's in a different language, well then.
Yeah,
Well-
and if you were in a refugee camp and somebody came to recruit you for work, you actually would do anything
Sure.
to get out of there. I
Yeah.
mean, you read about the conditions that
That's correct.
Syrians are living in right now.
That's right.
It's typical of any refugee situation.
That's right.
So it's hard, would they listen to no job and personal empowerment or any job?
An opportunity, or
Yeah.
what could be a potential
What could be,
opportunity.
yeah, right.
Well, and you can't assume, in our case, we had a union, but you can't assume unions are so weak and they're declining membership and resources. None of these people are ever going to be members.
No.
They're not going to pay dues. These are not, places you organize. But unless you have enough public and consumer conviction that this is not something to allow, but for those people who work in a big building, you don't have to think about what happens at midnight in that building. You're so glad to punch that clock and leave and come to Fair Grimes or whatever. And I think that's the problem. I mean, I've never read the book, I'm looking forward to it, but people are not just hidden in plain sight, they're hidden, period. And a lot of this happens in that way. I mean, we're on Debbie Downer here tonight. There's no, what's the happy conclusion we're going to
Well,
have?
I think the happy conclusion is that although a lot of people are, kept and not in plain sight, I think that there are, with the more awareness that there is, the more we will be able to see identifying red flags. And the more that we talk and the more that
And ask
you
the
pass
questions.
the word on, right? And so I think just having an idea in your head about what forced labor may be and what it encompasses, and just even right now sharing certain stories with you and you passing them on to other people, I think that that's getting the conversation started is actually the way that we bring about awareness. And the more awareness that there is, the more that you'll be able to identify something that's not going right.
We might want to have one of these dialogues with the eating house person, not soon, maybe, 4 or 5 months from now.
I'm just curious, in your book, do you have any examples of maybe internalized trafficking where it's within the families or
Yeah,
sometimes
so-
we talk about factories, but I'm wondering.
Oh, yeah, oh, certainly. Yeah, and that's kind of what I was saying is that in each country, there are a bunch of different scenarios. So in Mexico, for instance, there are certain regions of Mexico where this has been part of the family's economy for a very long time. And that's what they do. It is a family tradition. It wouldn't have been called human trafficking before, but it is. And there was a case, and I talk about it in the book, where women were brought to the United States and also trafficked within Mexico. And the way that they were manipulated is that initially the men of the family would romance these girls. And they would, and some of them were very young, and they'd romance them and offer opportunity. And then as soon as they managed to attract the woman, and as soon as they got them into a private space, they would rape them. And it was systematic. And this was, attract and then rape, so disempower. And they would have children with the women, and then keep the children. And so then women want their children, and they want to make sure their children are safe. So then there's one other means to control these women. And so there was one mother could not find her daughter. She didn't know where she went, and she had suspicions that she was in New York, and it was part of this family. It ended up being a huge case in the United States. But they were, there's certain areas in Mexico where that's been a family tradition, and that's what happens generation after generation after generation. And it's not just in Mexico yet.
Do you have any guidelines in the book, or is there like a place you can find them where if you think maybe there's a problem, like how to have a conversation with someone, like assuming that you can communicate with them at all?
I don't have that in the book. The book purely is an examination of these 24 countries and the different factors that go into it. So it's like a snapshot of each country. But my hope lately, in talking to people is to be able to tell them, if you want to learn what the red flags are, I think Polaris Project is an ideal spot. They actually have on their website various red flags to look out for. Now, some of them are accessible, like you mentioned, some are not. It's really hard, to know what wages people are making or if they're earning money. That's a harder one, to just look at a scenario and see whether somebody is making money. But there's certain things, are they not eating? And do they seem like emaciated? Do they seem scared? There's certain things that are more identifiable, and where you don't even have to have a dialogue with the person to realize that something isn't quite right. So, I would forward you to the Polaris Project and look at that, or look at. I think that app is really cool to be able to check that out, and just you can have it on your phone. Like I said, H&M is an A, and Puma is I think a B. Gap I think is a D. I can't remember off the top of my head. So I think the more that there's efforts that you're making, I think that the more that you'll be able to identify. But yeah, that's certainly part of my goal in talking to people, is to be able to have that discussion. But that was not the focus of my book.
It really doesn't seem so haphazard that these companies actually, what a windfall, someone just called me cheap labor. It seems to me like it must be more systematically organized in that, like maybe through business groups. Like a series of, does the Chamber of Commerce put on workshops about how to deal with these business situations, and here's somebody you can talk to or whatever.
Right. I think that the government very much emphasizes that this is not the way it's supposed to be, and that they have plenty of efforts going in that direction. I think the reality is when there's opportunity, companies take it. And when there's a chance to exploit, companies take it. And when there are recruiters who make it easy for them to turn a blind eye and say, okay, these are subcontractors, so I'm not, as the company, even responsible for being aware of what happens to these subcontractors. That's what you see oftentimes, is that the company's like, oh, well, I'm not in charge of the subcontractors, so blah, 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 I don't see what's happening.
Well, yeah, there are open labor seminars that people pay to attend to learn how to avoid labor laws and how to, fire people or.
This is a darker part of the workplace. This is, the increase of contingent and formal labor, the increase of home-based labor without fixed workplaces, the increase of all these things sort of allows more of this to happen in informal networks where the apparel industry, service industries in some cases, the back of the house, and lots of restaurants and whatever this is not Chamber of Commerce style. This is down where, more of the jobs, unfortunately, are starting to exist in this country.
It's just harder for me to understand how it seems more systematic to me, especially.
It is systematic, but not the level you're talking about. You want it to be systematic at a formal level where you can identify First Family Chamber of Commerce. It's systematic at an informal level, which is much harder to police than to identify, unfortunately.
You mean Mardi Gras clubs?
I don't know wherever you're going, I'm not there. Mardi Gras clubs, we could have a whole different discussion of why they're evil, but it's not this evil. It seems to be voluntary labor there. We're getting close to the, this has been a great conversation, but I want to make sure if there are some other questions that are on people's minds that they have a chance to ask them before Stephanie starts signing books and, seeing what happens with them here.
Yeah.
Any questions in the way back?
Yeah, exactly.
No pressure.
Tom, I did see you raise your hand. Could you just tell people where you are, Tom?
I'm right
Runs
here.
Octavia
Octavia
Books.
Books. And here we've got books. Some of them are signed, but we have some that aren't signed, and Stephanie will sign
She's
them.
got a hand and a pen, right, won't be forced labor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've been concerned about the injectable drug users in our community here in terms of, because sex trafficking and IDU is a very sort of intricately related kind of situation. And in a state, I'm from California, and in a state where having a safe needle exchange is illegal, how do you feel? Would you mind, both of you, would you mind speaking to the way that we can sort of reconcile that?
So can you explain that again?
So having
Well, I don't think you can reconcile
sorry?
it. You can't reconcile it.
You can't reconcile, but you can do it kind of under the radar is what we're trying to figure out how to do. But because of people who are under the influence, who are in the sex trafficking industry, how can you kind of fly under the radar but still give the health services that you need or that they need in terms of preventing HIV, Hep C, which are really big issues in our community here.
Right. I mean, I think that, well, then you kind of get into the dialogue of, what would happen if it were legal versus what happens with it being illegal, right?
Right.
Because monitoring is, of course, going to, in theory, happen more if we have legalization, right? So, and I touch on this very briefly in the book because I feel that it would be a book in itself to talk about the legalization of prostitution and how that goes hand in hand or may go hand in hand with human trafficking. And you look at certain examples, and so South Africa for a while was looking at legalizing prostitution. There was a big push for it for a while, and people had various opinions on it. But I interviewed a woman, and I think that this probably makes the most sense. If the infrastructure could support it, it would have been a very good decision. But right now, the government in South Africa is spread so thin, they don't even have the resources for what they have existing right now. So, even child protection right now is under-enforced. They don't have enough law enforcement, and they don't have enough personnel to even provide services. So you have a system that can't support regulation. So even if you made it legal on the books, would it be regulated? Chances are, in South Africa at this point, no. You have other examples where it has been legalized, or at least in certain areas, and the question would be, okay, so what has been the result of legalizing it? Has there actually been a step up in enforcement and then protection and making sure that that prostitutes are able to get what they need without being fearful of being arrested or prosecuted? So I think that would be the question, and I don't have the answer. I think I can see both sides of the dilemma. If you don't have an infrastructure, it's sort of, it's like having a great law on paper and nothing really happens.
Right. As a follow-up question,
Yeah.
how do you feel that sort of a mobile safe needle exchange within this conversation, within this population, and within sort of the unstably housed folks here in New Orleans, how do you think that would fare? I guess.
Can you repeat that?
How would safe needle exchange work out?
How would it work out? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts on it? I don't really know.
Right. I mean, in the sense that I think that a lot of folks within the industry sort of need to have some sort of substance in order to continue on. But that faced with the fact that they are, it's an illegal situation, and this is a rather Catholic. I'm from California. It's a rather sort of conservative country. It's a blue state within a red. It's a blue city within a red state. But I don't know, I mean, I'm in public health, and I think that we're trying to figure out how this might work
Right.
within our.
You mean without having to go the legalization direction, what are the potential options?
Right, and how do we
Somehow you'd have to have access to the population and have them trust you.
Yeah.
And I don't, you would probably actually know a lot more in terms of that direction of how to make that work. I think that part of the issue is when prostitutes are arrested, and particularly they're often treated as criminals, and they're often not properly screened to see if they're trafficking victims, particularly if they're from the United States. Now, I think that there is a change nationally, that there is more and more awareness in terms of the exploitation and rising to the level of human trafficking for prostitution. So I think that there is a momentum in that direction. I do, and sometimes that goes hand in hand with this sort of advocacy of eradicating prostitution, which isn't necessarily the best route to achieve, the goal, and the goal being, let's eradicate prostitution, not let's overall help human trafficking. Sometimes those agendas don't necessarily go hand in hand, and so I think you have to be wary of that. But I think that making sure that you have, or finding a way to have access to that population, and making sure maybe if having a good relationship with law enforcement and saying, hey, if you pick up anybody within, that's of this population, can you call us? And there are groups, when there are law enforcement teams that have really worked very well with organizations that will come in and have those discussions. So I don't know about in New Orleans. I mean, nationally, there has been a trend going in that direction. So I think making sure that, part of the problem is sometimes there's this lack of relationship or dislike between different groups, particularly with law enforcement. But law enforcement can be your biggest tool and aid in those type of circumstances. And if you can get them to see your perspective and make sure that these victims aren't treated as offenders, then I think you have a better likelihood of working on that.
Because oftentimes, law enforcement is the, most primary perpetrator of the sex victimization. At least
Let me make a suggestion. I know you got here a little late. Part of what we do in these dialogues is come up with very interesting topics, just like the one you want to talk about. So if you'll either reach out to me later, or Z, if you raise your hand.
Sure. Hi.
We'd be glad to have a conversation
Yes,
in one of these months coming up about this whole nexus of police and drugs and the needle exchange. Because I really think that's sort of a big area, where we are in forced labor and trafficking intersects here, but that's a separate subject that deserves attention. We're right here at the end of this. So get a hold of us later. We'll talk about a time when we can get some people together on that topic. Because that's what we do in these dialogues, and we've had a great crowd. And Stephanie Hepburn, I want to thank you. It's such a